welcome to the 2015 George B. Walsh Memorial Lecture. I'm Sarah Nutter, an assistant professor in the classics department. I'll say a few words about this series and then about our distinguished speaker, Professor Richard Hunter. After Professor Hunter's talk, he will be happy to take questions. The Walsh Memorial Lecture was endowed in 1989 in memory of George B. Walsh, an eminent literary scholar on Hellenistic poetry, among other things, who was both a University of Chicago College alumnus and a professor in the classics department. The aim of this event is to bring to the university a lecturer whose scholarly endeavors have shown the restlessness and excellence characteristic of George Walsh's own work. Since its founding, the lecture has become a keystone in the classics department calendar, and we've been honored to publish the Walsh Lectures in our scholarly journal, Classical Philology. Over the years, we have hosted such renowned scholars as Anne Carson, Claude Colomb, Michael Putnam, and Dennis Feeney, and we are very proud and excited to add the name Richard Hunter to this distinguished list. Richard Hunter comes to us from Cambridge University, where he is a fellow of Trinity College and the Regius Professor of Greek. As it happens, I was a student at Cambridge the year that Professor Hunter became the Regius Professor, and I was lucky to attend his inaugural lecture. This was 14 years ago, and I've been to hundreds of lectures since then, but this particular one has stayed with me. It was called I'm Coming After, which was also the title later of one of Professor Hunter's 20 books. On the one hand, this title, I'm Coming After, expressed Professor Hunter's acute awareness of the venerable history of the Regius Professorship, and also archly reflected his own long-standing interest in Hellenistic poetry, inasmuch as the poetry of the Hellenistic period self-consciously assumes a latter-day stance towards Homeric and Athenian literature. As you all know, Professor Hunter has been a pioneering figure in the rediscovery, so to speak, of this body of literature. Indeed, it is no exaggeration to say that Professor Hunter has laid the foundations of Hellenistic studies for generations to come with his 3 books on Theocritus, 2 and soon to be 3 on Apollonius of Rhodes, 1 on Callimachus, and several other books that cover Hellenistic and other Greek poetry more holistically. And this is to say nothing of his work on Greek comedy, Plato, ancient literary criticism, the Greek novel, and the influence of Hellenistic literature on Roman poetry. But on the other hand, Professor Hunter's phrase, I'm coming after, also performs as an invitation, I think, to adopt the orientation we find in his own scholarship, the imperative he brings to his audience of readers, scholars, and students that is his own cry of attention must be paid. For it names more than just an aspect of Hellenistic poetry's relationship to the past, and in fact goes beyond being a simple reference to any particular poetry or period, including the present that we occupy. It also evokes the notional relation of the present to the past, the particularly vivid and rarefied quality that the people, events, and texts of prior days can seem to possess in the face of our attention and desires. And finally, beyond this, Professor Hunter's coming after suggests a criterion for our own critical attention to the past, or rather, a call to see a reflection of ourselves straining to see into the past within the literature that we are straining to see. For as Professor Hunter has taught us, the ancient authors were themselves strenuous interlocutors with one another across the ages, over geographical boundaries and despite language barriers. Thus, Professor Hunter's work leads us to see Plato through Apuleius, Homer through Plato, Hesiod through Xenophon, Heraclitus through Callimachus, Callimachus through Catullus, Apollonius through Virgil, and on and on. But when Professor Hunter shows us how each author and work illuminates the next or the prior, these revelations do not take the form of a drab list such as I've just delivered, but feels rather like listening in on fascinating conversations, each one exquisitely composed and animated by Professor Hunter's own questions, his own feelings of discovery, his own gentle surprises. And since Professor Hunter is such a graceful and eloquent proponent of literary and critical juxtapositions, I'll end with the admission that these last phrases on discovery and surprise are not my own, but are in fact those of George Walsh and the speaking persona of Callimachus. Yet I think that such incisive descriptions of the poet's, quote, casual, unstudied grace will apply as well to the words we will hear from Professor Hunter this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming him today to speak to us on myth, fiction, and Homeric criticism.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's a very great pleasure and honor to be here. And I would like to thank Professor Payne and Professor Nutter and all their colleagues for the invitation. And it's a particular pleasure to speak in memory of George Walsh. The Varieties of Enchantment was one of the very first books of what I suppose we should call literary criticism I ever bought. And Walsh, as Professor Nutter has already said, later set new standards of sensitivity in his readings of Callimachia and epigram. He himself, of course, died far too young, and a Callimachian epitaphic poem would have been a very particularly appropriate way to remember him. I hope that he would have been interested, at least in the subject of today's lecture, truth, fiction, and the study of poetry, even if not in its substance. Now, it's hardly possible to think for long about the ancient reception of Homer without confronting the issue of how the ancients began to construct distinctions in what they read between, as the title of this lecture suggests, history, fiction, and myth, or between science and non-science. One of our problems is that it's very difficult to get back to a state of something like grace. Most of our texts in this area seem already contaminated by sophistications of one kind or another. But that is perhaps the point. Was there ever a state of grace? Rather than trying, as we shall eventually have to do, and has become normal in our discipline, to distinguish between archaic texts, which come from a world which still understood, indeed functioned through poetry and myth, and post-classical texts, which had lost their intellectual virginity, and for whom all this was mere play. I want rather to step in medias res with a text which is relatively early, almost certainly from the late 4th century before Christ, and I say it's relatively early, of course, to provoke, because, of course, viewed from another perspective, it seems horribly late. So here, passage 1 on your handout, in an awkwardly literal translation, is the extant preface to the collection of mythical rationalizations that goes under the name of Polyphatos. I have recorded these things concerning unbelievable matters. Some men are gullible and believe everything which is reported, as they have no familiarity with wisdom and knowledge, whereas others who are more subtle by nature and questioning, polypragmatoi in Greek, completely disbelieve that any of these things ever happened. My view is that everything which is reported happened, for they were not merely names without stories about them. First came the fact, and then the story about the facts. As for the shapes and forms which are reported and occurred then, and which do not exist now, these did not exist. For if anything ever existed in another time, it both exists now and will do so in the future. I have always approved the writers Melissus and Lemiscus the Samian, who say at the beginning of their work, and this is a particularly difficult bit of the text, but I won't go into its problems, there are things which were and which will be again. Poets and chroniclers, logographoi, have turned some of the things which have happened in the direction of the unbelievable and wonderful in order to amaze men. But I know that things are not possible such as they are reported, but I have also understood that if they had not happened, perhaps in some form, there would not have been reports. I travelled to very many countries and made inquiries of the older people as to what they had heard about each of these things, and I record what I learned from them. I myself saw the condition of each place, and I have written these things not as they have been reported, but after myself going and making investigations. Now that text, as I say, almost certainly from the late 4th century, is replete with problems of text and interpretation. But the general message, I think, is clear, and it's a text of very considerable interest, often regarded as much more interesting than the rationalizations which follow in the Polyphaton collection. Some of you will be familiar with this, is the idea that you explain myths as misinterpretations of historical fact. So that, for example, with centaurs, there clearly were never centaurs, because there are no centaurs now. So what happened was, the first time people learned to ride, riders were seen from a distance, and people thought these were actually half man, half horse, and that was why the story of centaurs arose. Medea wasn't able to rejuvenate people by boiling them. She actually ran a sauna, where she also sold hair colouring, so people would go in and come out looking younger, and hence the story arose that she could rejuvenate people. I mean, this is that's the story. Now, so this text dates almost certainly from peripatetic circles in the late 4th century. That is, at a crucial time for the development of collecting and thinking about myths and myth. For all that Polyphetus's denial of the possibility of weird and hybrid forms seems to look forward to Lucretius's very similar and very serious denial, it seems to me that the most obvious thing about this text, one might think, is that it is a knowing bluff. The whole thing might be, or seems to be, a rather po-faced joke. But just before you fall in the aisles with laughter, and I haven't noticed anyone doing that yet, you should bear in mind the sobering fact that, as far as I'm aware, although some modern scholars have recognized that Polyphetus himself probably did not go on extensive research trips, as he claims, or if he did, he at least gave misleading accounts of them to the financial office, the preface is almost universally taken, and not just in Germany, as a serious justification for the practice of myth rationalization, even by those who recognize that Polyphetus is adopting a pose. What, we might ask, does this tell us about our discipline? Now, the tone of the text reminds me in places of the tone, if not the arguments, of Lucian's True Histories. But be that as it may, the historiographical pose is the single most prominent thread which runs through its rhetoric. The opening tade periton apiston syngegrapha, with its witty tension between the historiographical verb, syngegrapha, and the subject matter, things you can't believe, uses a version of the same kind of paradoxical clash between style and subject which we find, for example, at the head of Seneca's Apocolocyntosis, the work on the deification of the Emperor Claudius. Quid actum sit in caelo volo memoriae tradere. I wish to record for posterity what happened in heaven. Another preface which plays, as does Polyphetus, with issues of belief in the unbelievable and with the authority of sources. If, however, the style, rather than the paradox, reminds us perhaps of Hecataeus' famous opening, it is in fact Herodotus whose presence, flagged by the closing hystoresas in the prologue, by the whole language of belief and the recording of reports, and by the self-representation of the writer as a travelling inquirer after truth, who hangs over this whole passage. But it is in part, of course, a Herodotus mediated to us through Thucydides' famous programmatic passage, passage 2 on your handout. So impatient of labour are most men in search of truth, and embrace soonest the things that are next to hand. Now he that by the arguments here adduced, this as you can see is Hobbes's famous translation, shall frame a judgment of the things past, and not believe rather that they were such as the poets have sung or prose writers have composed, more delightfully to the ear than conformably to the truth, as being things not to be disproved, and by length of time turned for the most part into the nature of fables without credit, but shall think them searched out by the most evident signs that can be. He, I say, shall not err. Polyphetus repeats Thucydides' charge against the unreliability of poets and chroniclers, and the reasons for it to make what is told more impressive, more effective in the language of ancient literary criticism, as ekplexis, we might say. But Polyphetus does not accept the Thucydidean claim that such things are annex electa, beyond investigation. Much indeed of the rich tradition of mythographical writing in the post-classical period may be seen as a series of attempts to meet Thucydides' pessimistic claim, and not just texts which are normally thought of as mythographic. In a famous passage which opens his life of Theseus, Plutarch compares himself to geographers and time to a map where, quote, the parts which escape geographers' knowledge, unquote, are put around the edge with labels which amount to "here be dragons." The equivalent distinction for the historian is between periods of time, quote, which may be reached by probable reasoning and offer territory for history, which stays close to real events, unquote, and those which are, quote, the stuff of marvel and tragedy, inhabited by poets and mythographers, where there can be no confidence or certainty. The Thucydidean heritage, which gives primacy to the process of investigation, to the drawing of inference from evidence, the how rather than the what, if you will, is very clearly on show in Plutarch's preface. Plutarch will not give up on the remote edges of time, but rather will do what he can to bring them under a familiar umbrella, and this is passage 3 on your handout. May I succeed in cleaning out the mythical element, perhaps a bit like Heracles cleaned the world of beasts, and making it obedient to reason and giving it the appearance of history. Where, however, it wantonly scorns credibility and will not accept an admixture of the probable, I ask for an audience which is well disposed and which receives this account of the distant past with indulgence. Plutarch accepts that there are some mythica which are beyond the exercise of logos. Polyphetus was not so faint-hearted. With a nod and a wink, Polyphetus sets out to show that even those things which have won their way to mythic status contrary to believability will yield before the march of Sophia and Episteme. The mixed signals which Polyphetus gives out are perhaps part of the point. Thucydides had claimed that men uncritically, abasanistos, receive reports about events in the past, even if they occurred in their own country. Polyphetus, having distanced himself from the tall tales of the poets and chroniclers, now tells us that what he is writing is what, in response to his inquiries, the older people in any locality had heard about their past. Some people simply believe ta legomena, and some deny their truth entirely, but Polyphetus positions himself between these two extremes by stressing both the fact that the legomena, what is said, preserve traces, an idea to which I will return, and one which of course also functions as an advertisement for Polyphetus's own logos, and the on-the-spot research he claims to have done. He has gone to do his own investigations, which consist in part of listening to the stories of old men, a research practice familiar indeed from such serious men as Pausanias. It has been argued that such an appeal to oral sources for myth lends credibility to the mythic analyses which Polyphetus proceeds to give us, but it seems more likely, at least to me, that the effect of Polyphetus's claim is just the opposite. Commentators on Polyphetus solemnly point out that asking even a very old man you might meet in the street about, for example, the Golden Fleece is unlikely, to say no more, to take you as far back as Polyphetus's rationalizations apparently go. But I hope that it is by now clear that solemnity is perhaps not the right mood in which to approach this text. Blanket skepticism, then, is in fact anti-intellectual. It resists the impulse to investigate and ask questions. And it's also self-defeating. Now, it would be easy to respond that this too is at best a ludic trope. We are all now being the late 4th century before Christ, educated men, pepaidumenoi avant la lettre. We know that myths as narrative fodder are being systematically collected and collated. The very idea of myth is being interrogated, and Callimachus's Aitia is not so many years away. This is not the "there was once a time" world of the early poets. Mythography, of which from some perspectives Polyphetus may be considered the first example to have survived, changes everything. Well, yes and no, I think. Polyphetus's complicated approach to storytelling is in fact not all that different from a Hecataeus or a Herodotus. From one perspective, Thucydidean strictures allowed the explicit written formulation of what was and continued to be inherent in Greek myth. Hesiod, and it may be argued Homer also, knew that mythic discourse was different from other modes, not worse or better, but certainly different. We exaggerate that difference, or rather exaggerate its importance, because so much of our evidence comes from those who were precisely interested in collecting this particular mode of discourse, an Apollodorus, for example. But Thucydides merely allowed people to say more clearly what they had always wanted to say. Now, one of the most enduring features of the literary recording and elaboration of myth broadly conceived in antiquity is indeed its capacity for embracing, indeed appearing to invite, the ludic. And this is one of the things I think that Polyphetus reminds us of. Comic poets, for example, found little difficulty in writing plays on the Oedipus theme, which we at least don't find so funny. It may indeed be this aspect of Greek myth, visible surely as early as Homer, think of Menelaus' seals, to which I will return, and occupying much of the foreground in, for example, the most significant mythological poems of antiquity, Callimachus's Aetia and Ovid's Metamorphoses, that for much of the last century gave myth a bad name, at least when set alongside ritual and cult. Polyphetus has usually been just a footnote, and yet he has more than a few notions in common with some of the greatest examples of such literary elaboration. Consider the famous opening, rather than the preface, of Apuleius's Metamorphoses, the Golden Ass. Lucius joins two other travellers on the road to Thessaly. Thessaly, the land of wonders, a place where traces of another order, buried elsewhere by change and progress, might well be believed to survive. And the first thing he hears is an imprecation against absurd and monstrous lies. He asks to be allowed to listen in, quote, as someone who, though not kuriosus, and there we might think of Polyphetus as polypragmatoi, nevertheless wishes to know everything, or at least nearly everything. To the complete skepticism of one of his fellow travellers, he feels compelled to oppose the fact that things which seem novel or difficult often prove not to be so, if you look at them a bit more closely, and this is your passage 4. You of thick ears and stubborn heart reject what is perhaps a true story. By Hercules, you are less than clever if your corrupted views make you judge as lies what has not been heard or seen before, or even what seems difficult beyond the grasp of the intellect. If you examine these things with a little bit more care, quasi Paulo accuratius exploraris, you will realize that they are not only straightforward to understand, but also easy to carry out. Here the Thucydidean and then Polyphetan tradition of investigation is to be put paradoxically to the defense of the marvelous. After Aristomenes has told his famous story of the death of Socrates, Lucius again defends what we might call an open mind, nihil impossibile arbitror. So this is now your passage 5. This was Aristomenes' story, but his companion, who from the very beginning had rejected his story in a stubborn disbelief, said, nothing is more fabulous than this fable, nothing more absurd than that pack of lies. And then he turned to me and said, to judge by your clothes and manner, you are a cultured gentleman. Do you accept the story? For myself, I replied, I consider nothing impossible, but all mortal experience is, however, the fates decided. Many amazing and almost unparalleled things happen to me and you and to all men, things which are not believed when reported to someone who is ignorant of them. It is not just that Polyphetus shares with Apuleius' narrator an interest in eide and morphai, forms and shapes, but that both sketch out the territory of response to myth in a shared language. even though put to utterly different uses. What we might think of as Lucius's plea on behalf of gullibility is in fact a pointed reminder that the Thucydidean tradition can go too far. For his part, Polyphetus pleads for a kind of third way, which seeks to go beyond simple skepticism in explaining how myth arises. The origin of the legomena of the stories which are told has now itself become an appropriate object of research. Apuleius's opening consideration of the credible and the impossible finds a close parallel in the possibly roughly contemporary Philopseudes e Apiston of Lucian, in which Tychiades, the man of fortune perhaps, plays the role of the cynical skeptic, confronted, as in Apuleius, with many unbelievable and mythical things. For the more credulous, however, his blanket skepticism is, as in Apuleius, laughable. And this is now passage 6 on your handout. The stories of the poets are perhaps not so bad, but how can it not be laughable that cities and whole peoples tell lies in unison and in public? The Cretans feel no shame in exhibiting Zeus's tomb. The Athenians claim that Erichthonius rose up from the earth and that the first men sprang up from Attic soil like vegetables. Their story, however, is much more serious than that of the Thebans, who relate that sown men sprouted from a snake's teeth. If anyone considers that these absurd stories are untrue, and through rational examination thinks that only a Koroibos or a Margites, they're the names of two proverbial fools, would believe that Triptolemus drove through the air with winged serpents, or that Pan came from Arcadia to help at the Battle of Marathon, or that Erythria was snatched away by Boreas, they think that this man is an impious fool for refusing to believe such obviously true facts. So great is the sway of falsehood. Now, the final myth which Tychiades cites there, Erythria snatched away by Boreas, is of course also a source reference. Lucian is there reworking one of the most famous Platonic passages, the famous passage of Plato's Phaedrus, in which Plato seems to make Socrates reject myth rationalization and therefore perhaps also reject Polyphetus's forerunners. And this is passage 7 on your handout. You remember we're outside the city walls of Athens, alongside the river Ilissus, and Phaedrus observes that this is the place where it is believed the Attic princess Erythria was carried off by the north wind. And Phaedrus asks Socrates if he actually believes this tale, Socrates having observed that this is not actually the spot, it's a bit further up. If I disbelieved, as the wise men do, hoi sophoi, I should not be extraordinary, atopos. Then I might give a rational explanation that a blast of Boreas, the north wind, pushed her off the neighbouring rocks as she was playing with Pharmakia, and that when she had died in this manner, she was said to have been carried off by Boreas. And you notice there a kind of rationalization very like one of Polyphetus's. But I, Phaedrus, think such explanations are very pretty in general, but they are the inventions of a very clever and laborious and not altogether enviable man, for no other reason than because after this he must explain the forms of the centaurs and then that of the chimera, and there presses in upon him a whole crowd of such creatures, Gorgons and Pegasuses, and multitudes of strange, inconceivable, portentous natures. If anyone disbelieves in these, and with a rustic sort of wisdom undertakes to explain each in accordance with probability, he will need a great deal of leisure. But I have no leisure for them at all, and the reason, my friend, is this: I am not yet able, as the Delphic inscription has it, to know myself. So it seems to me ridiculous, when I do not yet know that, to investigate irrelevant things, and so I dismiss these matters, and accepting the customary belief about them, as I was saying just now, I investigate not these things, but myself, to know whether I am a monster more complicated and more furious than Typhon, or a gentler and simpler creature to whom a divine and quiet lot is given by nature. Whereas Socrates, for his own reasons, rejects simple disbelief, apistia, and notes that anyone who wished to seriously to apply Sophia to some myths and outlandish mythic hybrids would be an unhappy and a very busy man. Lucian's Tychiades presents such an exercise of rationality as emphronos exitadze, precisely rational inquiry, but one which incurs a reputation for being impious and foolish. For Tychiades and Lucian, the matter is simply one of truth and falsehood, as it is also, for example, at the centre of the discussion on fabulous myths in Philostratus's Heroicus. But for the Platonic Socrates, there is another way forward, one that deals with more interesting monsters, such as Typhon. Typhon, who of course reappears in the famous image of the soul beast in Book 9 of the Republic. And a way forward which does not seek to reduce stories to the banally probable, one whose aim, moreover, is not the explanation of myth, but rather the employment of myth in the investigation of human psychology, rationality, and passion. Now, we, or I suppose I should say I, might as well call that way forward allegory. And it's worth reminding ourselves that when perhaps some 5 centuries later, the writer we know as Heraclitus, not that Heraclitus, one of the best known allegorizing accounts of Homer to have survived, and an author who appeals, as does Polythetus, to episteme, when Heraclitus notes that the ignorant take as mythical inventions what Homer in fact spoke philosophically, he too in fact stands within the Platonic path, for all that he then vents his spite against the philosopher. Heraclitus will also serve to remind us that rationalization, particularly in its simpler forms, is a form of allegorization. One thinks of the very opening of the Iliad. This is not Apollo shooting his arrows at the Greek army, this is a plague, and so forth. Now, the history of that allegorical way forward has been written many times, and I don't want to pursue it here, but it's Plato who shows us how productive Polythetus's rejection of blanket skepticism could actually be. Before leaving Polythetus, we may note that in his alleged attempt to steer a third way in the interpretation of myth, he is just one of a number of such accounts which survive from antiquity and beyond, and which testify to the very vigour of the debate, which in particular the nature of Homeric poetry provoked. When Heraclitus begins his allegorizing treatise, he notes that if Homer used no allegory, then all his poetry is impious, and he makes clear that that was a view that was actually held in antiquity. Such ignorant people occupy the same structural role for Heraclitus as do those who believe all the legomena do for Polythetus. Both know nothing of Sophia and or Philosophia. The debate is set out for us at rather fuller length in the commentary on the Iliad of the 12th century bishop of Thessaloniki, Eustathius. And here as elsewhere, the bishop will be drawing on earlier sources as well as upon the fruits of his own reflections and learning. For Eustathius, the two extremes are represented by those on the one hand who, quote, turn everything into allegory, even events and characters which are rooted in reality, so, in Eustathius's words, that the poet seems to speak to us in dreams. On the other side are those who, quote, have torn off Homer's wings and never allow him to soar aloft, unquote, by refusing to allow any allegorical interpretation. For these people, whose lawgiver, again in Eustathius' words, was of course Aristarchus, myths are just that, myths. For Eustathius, the third way, and the way he will follow, is like Polythetus's third way, the way of careful examination and discrimination, rather than the imposition of totalizing and undiscriminating systems. He will not be, of course, the last scholar whose practice is much less clear-cut and much more of a compromise than his proclaimed methodology. Eustathius lines himself up alongside those whom he calls the accurate ones, who take the trouble to investigate the material properly, That which is historical is accepted as it is, but with myths, they first consider their origin, nature, and plausibility, and then the nature of the truth which lies within them, which is to be revealed through allegorical interpretation. And there are ways which we could trace in which Eustathius is still a descendant of those programmatic chapters of Thucydides. Now, it might be interesting, I think, to triangulate the links, if any, between Aristotle's notion of literary probability, Polyphoton probability, and that probability which became such a potent notion, not just in rhetorical criticism, but also, I would argue, in seeking to determine the parameters of fiction and myth. Aristotle had famously, or at least famously for us, claimed that poetry was more philosophical and more ethically serious than history, because the former deals with general matters such as might happen. These are, quote, the kind of things which suit a kind of person to say or to do in accordance with probability or necessity, unquote. And this is what poetry aims at. Rhetorical criticism in education explored why literary characters spoke and acted as they did, in accordance with very sophisticated notions of moral behavior. Consider at one extreme the apparently banal rhetorical exercise of seeking to affirm, kataskue, or disprove, anaskue, the events of which poets, most notably Homer, had told. Now, a very powerful weapon in that rhetorical exercise was, of course, the appeal to probability. And so it is that, for example, in the very first in our collection of the anaskui, the disprovings, if you like, of Libanius of Antioch from the 4th century after Christ is, and I have to admit this is one of my favorites, quote, that it is not probable that crises went to the Greek ships. And one of the first kataskui confirmations is that the story of Achilles' anger is probable. In other words, are we or are we not to believe the story of Iliad 1? Now, one of the things which is most striking about these exercises, and I guess some of you will have to take my word for this, well, I suppose you have to take my word for everything, is the psychological depth and the level of calculation ascribed to Homeric characters. Now, this may be the fruit of rhetorical invention, but it is also very instructive about how poetical texts were read and the sort of characters that one expected to find there. In many ways, Libanius's modes of argument foreshadow some modern debates about character and human intelligibility in literature, most notably, of course, in Greek drama. Thus, for example, we are told that Agamemnon would not have opposed the wishes of the majority, as Homer claims he did, because he knew that the security of his own rule depended upon the goodwill of those under him. Whereas on the other side, it can be said that in being rude to Chryses and throwing him out of the Greek camp, Agamemnon acted as a careful commander by throwing a potential Trojan spy out of the camp. And Libanius also deals with what was a famous problem in antiquity, which is why when Chryses goes away and prays to Apollo, he prays for the destruction of all the Greeks, whereas Homer has told us that it was only Agamemnon who argued that his daughter should not be given back. All the other Greeks thought that the daughter should be given back. Why then did he pray for the destruction of all the Greeks? Well, this is Libanius's answer. Chryses knew that he would cause Agamemnon the greatest distress if he destroyed his position, caused his power to crumble, and put an end to his rule. For it is not the same for a man to meet once and for all with disaster as to remain alive and be in despair. The dead have no sensation of anything, whereas the man who lives in pain is truly punished. Moreover, Chryses also knew that if Agamemnon died and the war ended, then his daughter would go off with the Greeks. Whereas if the Greek army was oppressed by plague and was being destroyed, there would be an inquiry into the misfortune, the reason would emerge, and he would recover his child. Now, it would be easy to dismiss such explanation, which finds, unsurprisingly, close analogies in the exegetical scholia to Homer, as simply fertile display, without any real connection to the Homeric text. And yet the persistent questioning of action and motivation reveals a kind of close reading and active supplementation which have not always been applied to ancient texts in more recent times, and more importantly, a kind which one might think the opening books of the Iliad at least appear to invite. It was just such close reading and pondering on motivation which, in my view, contributed significantly to the development, precisely in the rhetorical schools, of what we label plasma or fiction, and which distinguished itself from mythos, where such chains of both physical and psychological plausibility no longer held. That is why mythos so often required the sideways interpretative move of allegorization to match that similarly sideways narrative jump, well captured by the Greek term paradoxon, the paradoxical, which so often travels with the idea of mythos. Polyphetus had introduced his collection by noting that a readiness to believe all the stories which one is told, it was a sign of being unacquainted with Sophia and episteme. If, as we have seen, he also notes the dangers of being too clever, he nevertheless flags up science, to use a loose approximation to Sophia kai episteme, as a sphere of both activity and discourse which stands in opposition to that of myth. Now this, of course, is not the place for anything like a full account of those oppositions. But Polyphetus does, I think, invite us to consider something of the various ways in which Hellenistic and later scholars sought to make sense of the stories with which they were confronted. For Polyphetus, stories are distorted traces of real events. They do not arise ex nihilo. And as such, we might naturally be tempted to associate Polyphetus with geographical writing, which also sought to map and make sense of traces. One of our richest and best known texts here is the first book of Strabo's Geography, which discusses Homer and Homer's geography in the light of Eratosthenes' criticisms that 1, poetry was concerned with entertainment, not instruction, and 2, that the accuracy of Homer's geography made no contribution to his skill as a poet anyway. Strabo takes a view of poetic historicity not entirely unlike Polyphetus. For Strabo, too, legends, even apparently outlandish ones, are not inventions, plasmata, of poets and prose writers, but rather they are traces, ichnia, literally footprints of people and events of the real past. For Strabo, it is almost axiomatic that Homer would not simply create from nothing. I say almost axiomatic, because although Strabo does, in fact, just assert this to him self-evident truth, proof, which we at least would label circumstantial, exists for him in Homer's whole character and in that of his poetry. As for the former, the opening paragraphs of Book 1 precisely depict Homer as a man of, in Polyphetus's phrase, Sophia kai episteme, literally a philosophos, in fact, but also a polypragmatos in the best sense of that term. Apuleius's Lucius, we recall, quote, wished to know everything, or at least nearly everything, whereas Strabo's Homer, quote, took pains to know as many praxes as possible and to hand them down to those who came after him. It's easy enough, of course, to see that Strabo's Homer is in part fashioned from the poet's own Odysseus, the man who knew the cities and minds of many men, and who did indeed record these for posterity, and in part on Strabo's own sense of himself as a serious man of education in a culture where the bios politikos was indeed at the centre of the interests of the real or imagined audience. Like Polyphetus, at least in his self-presentation, Strabo too was a great traveller and inquirer, standing in a line of descent which went back to Odysseus and to Homer himself. At the very beginning of the geography, as he introduces us to his Homer, Strabo shows us another way in which maps are a very good metaphor for poetic myth. We have seen that Polyphetus placed himself in the Herodotean tradition of the travelling inquirer, and is of course familiar that Homer is regularly depicted in the ancient lives of Homer as a traveller. So it was not difficult to bring these two traditions together in making Homer a kind of proto-Herodotus, as Herodotus himself, of course, may already have done. And this is precisely what we see Strabo, as he appeals to the Homeric lives, doing in the course of his rebuttal of Eratosthenes. For Strabo, prominent characteristics of Homer are the love of knowledge and the love of travel, which may be seen as, in fact, as a transcription into prose of the opening verses of the Odyssey, here written in the language of scholarship. Strabo's Homer will have travelled to Egypt just as his successor, Strabo, did. We must remember that when, a century or so later, Longinus, famously on the Sublime, describes Herodotus as Homerikotatos, most Homeric, the poet had in fact long been fashioned in the image of the historian. Homeros Herodikotatos had just as good a claim to critical reality. In introducing Homer as a man of consummate knowledge, both of public life and of the geography of the whole world, Strabo notes, and this is now your passage 9 on your handout, for if that were not the case, he would never have reached as far as the furthest bounds of the inhabited world as he travelled around it in a circle in his description. Travelling for an inquirer can take more than one form, and here Strabo surely deliberately runs the language of description and the language of travelling together. Modern editors and translators differ as to whether teimneme in that Greek sentence should be taken with the verb affikato, reach to, or with the participle perion, but it's rather, I think, the richly significant language which is to be noted. Poets, Homer above all, travel around the world and thus map it for us. If we turn from the poet to his poems, we may infer, so Strabo implies, from the fact that the vast bulk of what Homer describes is either factual or has a factual basis, that this applies to the poems as a whole. Moreover, as Homer's poetry is universally acknowledged as a suitable subject for philosophical investigation, a philosophema, and this could not be the case if it was simply invented ex nihilo. Whereas for Polyphetus, myth arose as a kind of sideways leap into error arising from misunderstanding, a misunderstanding that fundamentally changed the nature of what was being described. For Strabo, the mythical and the fantastic are rather additions which may to some extent distort, but do not fundamentally alter the truths which remain visible below the accretions. Homer, for Strabo, takes his archai, his starting points, from historia. What does Strabo mean by the historia from which Homer took his starting points? For some translators and commentators, this is simply what is handed down, or it is his own researchers. But I think it's plain that Strabo does understand Homer to have drawn on his own knowledge in building his mixture of the true and the false. And so the question becomes one of the source of that knowledge. Now, Strabo's first set of examples perhaps poses more questions than it answers, and this is now part of your passage 11. Homer took his starting points from historia, for they say that Aeolus ruled over the islands around Lipari, and the inhospitable Cyclopes and the Lystragonians over the regions around Etna and Leontini. The result was the area around the strait was unapproachable for men of that time, and Charybdis and the Skylion were the haunt of pirates. Now, whereas we would be tempted to say that these so-called historical facts were in fact post-Homeric interpretations of Homeric geography, and in one case at least, a rationalization of Homeric myth. We know, for example, from Polyphetus that Scylla was quite often rationalized as actually a Tyrrhenian pirate who grabbed men. Strabo takes these reports as evidence for the historical core of Homer's account of Odysseus's wanderings, or perhaps even as themselves the source of Homer's knowledge. Through Historia, then, Homer learned things for which, though of course Strabo does not say this, Homer is himself the principal authority. Another way of putting this is to say that in searching for the historical core upon which Homer has elaborated, Strabo seizes upon the results achieved by various post-Homeric traditions which had sought precisely to demythologize Homer and to find ways of accommodating him both to contemporary geography and to a sense of what is possible in nature. If indeed the task of the interpreter is, in Larry Kim's words, to reverse the poetic process and pare away the mythical aberrations and additions in order to discover the factual basis from which the poet began the creative process, then Strabo has done no, unquote, then Strabo has in fact done no more than accept and make use, in a rather eclectic way, of the work of those who had gone before him. The very vagueness of Historia masks Strabo's operation and casts back into an indeterminate past a popular knowledge which may have been available to Homer himself, or so we are led to believe. In an important methodological statement, Strabo notes, and this is passage 10 on your handout, since the tellers of myth, and most of all Homer, do not tell myths in all they say, but for the most part add myth, pros mutheosin. The person who investigates what mythical element the ancients added does not investigate whether the added mythical elements existed or still exist, but rather investigates the truth concerning the places or the people to which the mythical elements were added. For example, whether the wanderings of Odysseus happened and where. Strabo indeed finds proof of what we might call this additive theory of myth, one not, of course, all that far, in fact, from what Thucydides had said about the activities of poets and logographers, not just in what Homer describes, but in the language in which he describes processes of artistic and verbal creation. And the clearest example of this is also in your passage 11 from 1 to 9. Thus it is that our poet, though he sometimes employs fiction for the purposes of instruction, always gives preference to truth. And then we have three little snippets from Homer. He also added ende etithe, of course, from the making of the shield. He also added what is false, merely tolerating it in order the more easily to lead and govern the multitude. As a man binds with a golden verge bright silver, a line from the Odyssey, so Homer, heightening by fiction actual occurrences, adorns and embellishes his subject, and so forth. In very quick succession, then, Homer's processes of adding myth are compared to Hephaestus' making of the shield of Achilles, Athena's beautification of Odysseus in Odyssey 6, and finally to Odysseus' false tale like truth, to Penelope in Odyssey 19. This final example takes us, that is, you may, when the poet, as you know, famously says that Odysseus told Penelope many things like truth. That example takes us not just sideways to what the Muses say to Hesiod at the opening of the Theogony, but also forward via Plato to the development of what we might call a theory of fiction in the Hellenistic and later periods. Basic to any such theory, ancient or modern, is a distinction between types of narrative. The most famous such ancient distinction was that between history, fiction, and myth, and Strabo's discussion should be seen as a contribution to emerging ideas of the fictional and the mythical. Strabo's language of historical process, which both seems confidently to carry an argument forward, but is in fact extraordinarily vague and short on, detail. The vagueness works, of course, in Strabo's favour. We are so used, above all from Herodotus, to such language, and to the distinctions between history and myth, that Strabo appears to be describing the most natural process in the world. In fact, he is creating a historical and historicizing Homer before our eyes, and the very audacity of the undertaking is too often overlooked in our general sense that Strabo is a comfortable and comforting old boy who will not be making too many demands on our or his grey cells. And we have, of course, all heard lectures like that. Now, I've already more than once alluded to this threefold division between historia, plasma, and mythos, and suggested that one way of considering Strabo's discussion is as a contribution to emerging ideas of the fictional and the mythical. Strabo does not in fact use this characterization in his discussion of Homer, but he does in his discussion of Polybius's account of the wanderings of Odysseus. He does cite the historian's view that if certain observable geographical facts do not agree with what poets write, then the fault will lie either with changes in geography or with the poet's ignorance or poetic license, which consists of history and diathesis and myth. Now that trio, diathesis, probably means something like rhetorical elaboration. That trio recalls the threefold rhetorical division of narrative material to which I have already referred, but it also raises a number of questions. It has been objected that it is not poetic license, but rather poetry itself, which consists of these three elements. But I think it is clear that Strabo's discussion here of Homer opens a window not merely onto ancient Homeric criticism, but also onto ancient attempts to delineate the boundaries of myth, attempts which are still very influential in the modern discussion of myth. Now, to conclude, I think it's worth repeating, and I fear it's probably been too submerged in this lecture, that so many of these critical and interpretative issues were not merely sharpened in the discussion of Homer, but were, of course, already there in Homer himself. Now, this again is not the place to flog the question of bardic truth. So let me just conclude with one Homeric pony which might just have a little life left in it. Menelaus's account to Telemachus of his Nostos in Book 4 of the Odyssey raises all kinds of questions, I think, in the present context, because it very obviously foreshadows Odysseus' account of his own return in various ways, but does so not just at greatly reduced length, but also in a lower, what we might call more realistic key. Not, of course, that there is anything strictly realistic about sea goddesses, about disguising oneself as a seal, and the metamorphoses of Proteus. Indeed, as is well known, the figure of Proteus was subject to some of the most richly allegorical readings of any Homeric character, who, after all, notes Heraclitus, would really choose to sleep with a seal. Nevertheless, when we consider the geography of Menelaus's travels, which, whatever view one takes of them, do stand in sharp contrast to those of Odysseus, or we consider motifs such as that of the companion's hunger, for which the attempted cure is fishing rather than killing the cattle of the sun, it is, I think, clear that Menelaus's Nostos is in many, though not all respects, ordinary in comparison to that of Odysseus. When Menelaus is, like Odysseus, driven off course while rounding Cape Malea, southeast bottom of the Peloponnese, he ends in Egypt, where, quote, he travelled around collecting rich resources and gold, a detail that reminds us perhaps of Odysseus' Cretan tales. Odysseus, on the other hand, was swept for 9 days from Cape Malea to the land of the Lotus Eaters. In this Nostos, Menelaus, described as polypathon kai pol epilethes, having suffered many things and wandered very much, is clearly set up by Homer as a kind of Odysseus light. The reason for Menelaus being detained in Egypt, his failure to offer sufficient sacrifices to the gods before setting out, reads in fact very like the kind of post factum explanation for problems that anyone could make in antiquity. No inference from trouble is more common in ancient texts than that some god or gods must have been offended, an inference which also, of course, suggests a cure. Now, this is not, of course, or perhaps I should say not necessarily, to suggest that the whole episode of Eidothea, the seals, and the metamorphoses of Proteus are to be understood as figments of Menelaus's imagination, dressing up a very ordinary explanation for lack of forward progress in exotic mythological clothing, especially, of course, as modern scholarship has repeatedly speculated that Menelaus's adventures were, in an earlier version of the Odyssey, precisely Odysseus's adventures. Be that as it may, however, there is in the Odyssey we possess a very great difference, I think, and I think this is clear, between the travails of Odysseus, held for years by a lovesick goddess, and the object of Poseidon's cosmic wrath. Once Menelaus has made his sacrifice, it is all apparently smooth sailing. But once he gets home, Odysseus not only has the suitors to deal with, he then has the famous journey carrying an oar to the ends of the earth to look forward to, an elaborate sacrifice to Poseidon, and then, when he gets home again, further sacrifices to all the immortals in succession. We may sense here not just the way in which Homer arranges Menelaus' Nostos to the greater glory of Odysseus, observe, for example, the fact of Menelaus' total dependence upon Eidothea, whereas in the Cyclops adventure, the bringing of the wine, the blinding, the trick of the sheep, and so forth, are all products of Odysseus' intelligence. But I think we glimpse also the beginnings of a difference between plasma and mythos. If certain aspects of Menelaus' Nostos do indeed recall the Cretan tales, then we will also be reminded that those tales take a very honoured position in the history of fictional narrative. False things like true, which seems an appropriate motto on which to end. Thank you.
I was glad you touched on Herodotus, although he wasn't in the handout. And I was wondering, of course, Herodotus begins by sort of retelling the Hellenic story, among others, and so he cites Homer and then he skips forward as if he's going to do it better, that sort of thing. But I wasn't aware that maybe he was self-fashioning himself as a Homer in simply the idea that he had traveled, as if he knew Homer. Is that something that you were suggesting?
Well, I mean, yes, I think I was. I mean, clearly, clearly this is, not that this is, as it were, any kind of key to Herodotus. But I think part of an explicit, part of Herodotus' explicit acknowledgement of the tradition in which he stands is Homer. And so, clearly, it's very obvious with Strabo that this is the image. But I think the tradition, at least, had clearly fashioned Herodotus, as it were, as very clearly in his Historia, as standing in the Homeric model. And I think, all I would want, as far as I'd be happy to go, would be that the seeds of that idea, that is, of the Homeric Herodotus, of Herodotus in the image of Homer, as somebody doing research and reporting back and so forth, the seeds of that are already in Herodotus themselves.
Okay, the seeds alone.
Yeah, the seeds. I'm not talking about a full. No, I certainly wouldn't claim for a full-blown.
Because the texts you're looking at are much later.
Yes, they are indeed. But I think, as so often, I think the seeds for that are drawn out of reflection upon Herodotus. They're not just the idea of a Homeric pattern is not something just imposed on Herodotus. It's something which grows out of reflection upon Herodotus' own practice and self-presentation.
And it seems that Herodotus must map in here somewhere.
Yes.
Because he has his own strange way of handling
Indeed, yes, and I mean I think the idea of that particularly when you're there is this Strabo, of course, is very much later, but there is this striking sort of similarity between thinking about how you map the world literally, and also thinking about what sense you can make of myth as as trace.
Yeah, thank you. Mark?
Okay, I was wondering if you could say something about the extent to which it's possible to trace the kind of impact of cosmological thinking on sort of literary critical models of creation. I was thinking about your remarks of like about ex nihilo creation, and think about that in the in relation to the Strabo Eratosthenes debate that we all know. I mean, do positions on that issue of fictional invention sort of by and large follow kind of predictable sort of school lines?
Well, when does it follow predictable?
Well,
of course, particularly of course with Strabo, we deal with essentially Stoic Line.
Yeah.
It's interesting the idea of whether the sort of the what came before what does this what do these stories tell? I mean you go back and think, for example, of Plato's Atlantis stories and similar. In terms of cosmology, I mean, are you thinking of whether there is an analogy between accepting that these things are traces of something which happened in the past, therefore a way of similarly the way you work out how the world was formed?
Yeah, exactly.
Is by looking at the way the world is now and working out how it must have been formed.
Yeah. And if you have a certain kind of if you buy into some kind of model for the origin of the cosmos, does that how does that kind of impact your understanding of poetic invention or
I think it must to some extent too, and that might also help with the idea of why it's the Stoics who are who sort of are taking the lead in this. I mean, I haven't actually specifically thought of it, but I mean that's yeah. I mean, I think because when you think of some of the how the world was formed, and how animals came out of it. I mean, again, in a sense, there is always in those stories a sense of you can always find traces still surviving which show you what it was like before. So I mean, that is interesting. I mean, and Empedocles would be presumably that a key figure there. I mean, I'm afraid I'll just have to think about that more. But that's interesting. Thank you.
Jane?
Yeah, I was very struck by the examples that you chose from, obviously, the very beginning, with the Iliad, and the question of what is probable.
Yeah.
That, for instance, it's not probable that Agamemnon would ignore the will of the people.
Yes.
And so forth. It seems to me that there's a very strange sense of probability in a certain sense. This is what happens. Now, it's clearly problematic that it happens. In other words, and that's how you start a story. You have something going on that really is a problem and has to be dealt with. The thing that I don't hear in the tradition in place, which you know so much better than I do, is the focus on error, which strikes me as being at the core of the probability issue in the Poetics. How do you explain the fact that somebody did something that was erroneous? You don't want to just have it be bad people who do bad things. That's not very interesting. But there's an interesting kind of error, and the probability, as you find its probability, you now have something like a plot. Now, is that in the later tradition or not?
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. I mean, and Agamemnon was always a very, for rhetorical and indeed for scholastic critics, as you know, of course. I mean, Agamemnon was always a very problematic character because on the one hand, he was the leader of the Greeks. And the basic assumption of rhetorical criticism is that great men don't make mistakes. You just have to, they don't make mistakes. You have to understand what they're up to. And so, this is why, for example, we have this very, a very rich tradition of explanations of Iliad 2, where he tests the troops. And we have long accounts surviving of why actually it was a clever thing to do, although a sort of, you might think a neutral reading of Homer would suggest that the test was nearly a catastrophe, were it not for Odysseus' intervention. I think the business with for the ancient tradition, the problem of Agamemnon's behavior in Book 1 was a very, very difficult problem, and precisely as you say, why does he do this?
But he explains why he does it, he just wants to.
Yes, exactly. But the question of why he does that, why he actually made that, what was always, with Achilles, it was, in some ways, it was easier for the tradition, because with Achilles you could put a great many things down to anger. And you could associate, and you could also say not only anger, but that Achilles was the, as you know, was the sort of model for somebody whose character was always shifting, who was an inconsistent person. And so you could always, in a sense, if you wanted to, say that you could trace Achilles' behavior to his. With Agamemnon it was different, because it was very hard to know what to do, because he was the lead, he clearly had made these mistakes. I think the question of, as you say, why did he make this mistake, other than that he just wanted to do it? I think you're right. I don't think the tradition really comes to grips with that. It's more of a question, with these, for example, the example I put, as to thinking about, they create reasons for why he might behave like that, but they don't actually create a kind of theory of fiction, as I think you're suggesting, which the starting point is a mistake, is some kind of disruption of the natural order, for which then has to be created, made probable.
And let's say if great men never made mistakes, we'd have a much easier life.
But no, that great men don't make mistakes is, broadly speaking, a very important principle for ancient critics. You have to understand what they're up to.
Liz?
Well, no, if anyone, I'll go last.
Oh, no.
Well, I hesitate to say this at any length here, but the test is not a problem. Agamemnon has a sound idea. He just goes to extremes in presenting it, and he doesn't realize how bad the morale of the army is. So much for the test. The Chryseis scene has been, the mechanics of it are being ignored. Chryseis is not a supplicant. He is not adopting the manner of a supplicant. He's a powerful person, and he's going around continuously trying to bribe the army. He's a presence. Now, nobody tells him that Agamemnon alone can give him what he wants. No one tells him that. He's a chicken to be plucked, and he doesn't ask. The army shares Agamemnon's guilt, which is why Apollo punishes him. And Agamemnon is not just angry because somebody asked for something he wants. He's angry because the army has behaved in a manner that is impudent. The priest supplicates Agamemnon and Menelaus. He doesn't have a clue that Agamemnon is the only one who can make the decision, and no one has told him. And he's been humiliated in front of the entire army. He's a very proud man, and his pride has been hurt more than his love for his daughter, and that's why he asks for the Greeks to be punished.
I mean, that's very interesting. Thank you. I mean, that would be an extremely, good example of the kind of thing Libanius did, an alternative example. But I mean, this is, as it were, filling in the point I was making was that these rhetorical exercises filled in the gaps of psychological motivation and indeed narrative, which Homer does not spell out. And I mean, I think, we don't, for any particular explanation, we don't have to accept them or not. And I mean, your explanation might be a much better explanation, but in principle, it's the same kind of activity as we see in these, and that, which is very, and that's why in some ways, I think these exercises, which are often, often dismissed as, just some kind of fertile nonsense, are in fact, in many ways, the forerunners of, modern criticism. Actually, of some forms of modern criticism.
I was thinking of Frankel's famous comment that Agamemnon steps on the carpet.
Yes.
He's a perfect gentleman.
He's a gentleman. Yes, that's right. And he doesn't want to say no to his wife. Yes. And of course, he's tired. He wants his bath.
And he's a wonderful reader of the Agamemnon.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is
Liz, did you have?
Yeah, I was thinking, thanks for a wonderful collection of material. I was thinking that Polithatus is sort of fits into an Aristotelian research program. He wants to, I think it's a bad peripatetic,
yes.
Okay, but he wants to make sure to investigate, okay, stories about sort of abnormalities and wonders and so on.
Right.
Because okay, that's okay, like a good Aristotelian. You
Like,
go out
yes.
and you look at your marine animals.
You collect,
and they're weird and wonderful and so
yes.
on. So you want to make, okay, what extent the boundaries of scientific knowledge. And then he brings in this principle of it doesn't exist now, okay, never did exist or can exist in the future, which is kind of a perversion of an Aristotelian commitment to the stability of the species. Okay, but so that fits kind of a peripatetic. But then Strabo, okay, is another looks to me like a wholly different kind of fish, which is, I mean, he sort of flaunts the Stoic line, which is, okay, there's a kernel of fact and then there's addition of myth, okay? And he uses that distinction a little bit loosely. I mean, I think some of the Stoics would really reject the way, would totally reject the way this, because the addition, you could say, all that divine apparatus is just an addition to facts. I mean, okay. So it does not go very far.
No, I mean, I think it's generally accepted that Strabo's methods are not, as it were, whatever you want to say, straightforward Stoics, or in any sense. But I do think, obviously you're right, that, and I hope, it's clear the difference between Polithatus and Strabo. Yet it does seem to me, and one being interpreting the myth as coming from a misunderstanding of some kind. The other, as you say, being simply an addition to make the poetry more attractive. But nevertheless, there is still, I think, a really striking similarity between the two of them, even if there's also striking difference.
What I wanted to add is, and this is apropos of the great men, okay, that Strabo, may have been influenced by sort of a line of thought initiated by or promoted by Posidonius, okay, which is that initially humans, there were wise people, okay, among humans, and they're responsible for all our skills. So he may look back to Homer, okay, with a view through the lens of Posidonius and those who were influencing. Wise person, initially the founder of all our, the inventor, founder of all our skills, and he had. Yeah. Okay, so he was a great man. Okay. Yes. A great man.
Yes. No. I think that's right. Clearly by putting, Strabo in a sense sort of alongside Polithatus, obviously, of course, in the lecture I ignored, a great deal one can say about Strabo's, the intellectual heritage behind Strabo, because then there's obviously a great deal more Polybius there as well as Posidonius that that I was able to touch on. Yeah, but no, that must be right. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when Socrates was talking about this myth of Orthria, this myth has it's part of the lived experience of the Athenians. The story that the Athenians believed that Boreas sent the wind that destroyed the Persian fleet. So there's a way in which first of all, they become palpable as explanations for what happens, right, in history, but also they then go on, I think Herodotus says that they begin to sacrifice on that promontory to Boreas as if he were a relative, as if he was related to the Athenians. So this is a different idea, of myth. But it's interesting that Socrates
they chose that one, yes, yeah. And the
so that's important. Yeah.
But I mean, I do think that, yes, that is more. I mean, and clearly Socrates is, but it does seem to me that the key point, a key point there is, the question of what you do with myth. I mean, you either rationalize it in some way, or you do it, you do it in a much more productive kind of way. And the choice of Typhon is clearly not, well, it's obviously not accidental, but I mean, it's clearly very potent because he's a much more interesting monster than a chimera or a for one thing because of his voices. And then he, of course, reappears when Plato is seriously discussing the soul, which is presumably what Socrates is talking about there. Well, that's what most people assume Socrates is talking about when he says about the kind of investigation he wants to conduct.
Yeah. Thank you again for what we talked. So I have a question about Homer being lumped together here with the tellers of myth, sort of as in the beginning of number 10 on the handout, where Strabo says, "She's the tellers of myth, and most of all, Homer do not tell myth," and so on. And I see something interesting there in that parts of your talk you were bringing in the sort of the idea of getting at what Homer's process would have been as a poet, right, and reconstructing that. And that seems something which you can do once you have a poet, which is much harder to do with a myth that may have a variety of sources or can feel more impersonal. That we're more in the, and that seems to then allow that question of taking implausible things as markers of something that really happened, then become sort of part of something that a poet actively does, right? So it sort of creates a category of an action that what a poet might do. And my question is, are you aware of that kind of procedure for a poet being attributed to any other poet other than Homer?
Ah, right.
Can that be extended, and does it get extended to poets even who aren't lost in the mists of the past, and who we can actually say, no, we have other accounts of what happened at that time? So does it grow into a different kind of category for
right. I mean, that's a very interesting question. I mean, just to go back to where you started, I mean, I think I actually can't remember now. I suspect this translation is just taken off TLG. I suspect. I can't remember. But I think the subject of the verb must be presumably either be the ancients or poets generally. But the question, I mean, the substance of your question is whether, about whether what Strabo says poets do, and not just Strabo alone, is generalizable beyond, when you're dealing with later or contemporary poets. And that's very, partly, of course, we're hamstrung by the fact that the vast majority of the relevant ancient discussion is precisely about Homer. But, for example, Strabo refers on a number of occasions to Callimachus. He seems to be interested in Callimachus, partly, I guess, because he, in a sense, he recognized that Callimachus, too, as he describes him, was, a man of great researches. So, I mean, he recognized Callimachus as something of a kindred spirit in some ways. But he also takes Callimachus to task for making factual mistakes. Now that in a sense that's a slightly different case than you're asking about, but it is a case where, as it were, there are contemporary clear records for Strabo, and he can point to the fact that Callimachus has made an error of fact about it. What he doesn't say, and this is an interesting case, but he doesn't say that's because Callimachus is a poet. He there treats Callimachus as, if you like, a scholar like he is, and say he got it wrong. He doesn't, I mean, off the top of my head, I can't, I mean, if we stick just with Strabo, off the top of my head, I can't, well, no, I can think, I mean, there are, he does, for example, treat Hesiod in the same way. And, I mean, a very interesting case, which, much more to be done about, would be Strabo's treatment of the Argonautic story. I mean, Strabo clearly, I think, knew Apollonius's account, as most people did in his time, and he takes the famous passage in the Odyssey of, which suggests that Homer knew the Argonautic story, and uses that as as he discusses this at length. And if you just read Strabo without first, you'd think that, for example, Medea was a major character in Homer, but of course Medea is nowhere mentioned in Homer. And so I think to that extent there is for Strabo at least, for all early poetry helps him to illuminate Homer. What I can't think of, the kind of text which presumably would be the kind of text you're looking for would be a drama. Where Strabo would take the account of a myth in Euripides, say, and say, well, this has a core reality, but Euripides is. But I'm not saying I can't off the top of my head think of such an example, and I suspect that in a sense, so much of this whole discourse is both generated by and then used to illuminate Homer, that it may be that it's actually hard to find. What you do, of course, I think, find in, but I do think, for example, I mean, you find similar things. For example, I do think you find in the Scholia to Apollonius, you find claims that something that Apollonius here has acted like a poet or used poetic license in this way. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we're actually right at time, so let's all thank Professor.